Everyone was focused on the disappearance. Nobody looked down to see what the ground was holding. That sentence could stand as a warning about how we search for answers. We scan headlines. We demand explanations. We chase the missing. But sometimes the story that's been ignored is literally beneath our feet. On a humid morning in San Francisco, May 9, 2016, a crew working under a single-story house slid a jackhammer into concrete and exposed a small, sealed cavity. They expected rubble. What they found instead was a tiny coffin, made of lead and bronze, fitted with a glass viewing window. Through that glass, the workers saw a small figure in white, clutching something like a rosary and a bouquet of purple flowers. Nothing about the scene invited spectacle. It invited questions. Erica, the homeowner, remembers the call from the crew and the moment she arrived at the site. The men who had been tearing out the old garage floor did not scream or leap back. They stood, quiet and uncertain, more confused than alarmed. For Erica, the discovery meant her house had, without her knowledge, been built atop an older story, one that ended with a child placed into a tiny coffin and sealed beneath a patch of earth that would later be paved over. If that image chills you, it should. But the immediate shock gave way to practical human problems. The property was private. The remains were legally neither fully the responsibility of the city nor entirely the homeowners. Who was supposed to manage the delicate work of excavation, forensic analysis, and reburial? And who would pay? Estimates floated in the early days suggested a proper archaeological process, and reinterment might cost anywhere from roughly $7,000 to $24,000, depending on the level of forensic testing and ceremonial arrangements. Those numbers are estimates and varied by source, but they framed the dilemma. A private homeowner confronted the weight of public memory. Into that gap stepped Garden of Innocence, a non-profit devoted to giving unattended children proper burials and, when possible, restoring their identities. Founded by volunteers who felt that abandoned graves deserved dignity, the organization offered to fund the immediate reinterment and to pursue a longer, more painstaking effort to find out who the child had been. Garden of Innocence coordinated with San Francisco authorities, invited archaeologists and forensic specialists to inspect the coffin, and began the search that would stretch over months. The investigation was methodical and, some days, painfully slow. Researchers sifted through tens of thousands of burial records, official ledger entries that, across decades, recorded names, ages, and burial plots. They compared those records to historical maps of the neighborhood dating back to the late 19th century. The block where Erica's house sat had once been dotted with small cemeteries and family plots. As the city expanded, developers moved headstones and bodies. Sometimes they documented transfers, sometimes paperwork vanished, and sometimes graves were left behind. Matching the old burial plots to modern property lines required overlaying maps from as early as 1870 against contemporary surveys. It was meticulous cartographic detective work. Genealogists joined archivists. They traced family trees and cross-checked names with death dates and infant mortality records from the era. Volunteer researchers compiled a short list of possible matches. But paper can be wrong, names can be copied incorrectly, and graves can be relocated by mistake. The definitive identification would come from science. Garden of Innocence arranged for DNA analysis, which involved collaboration with the University of California and local forensic labs. Relatives were contacted. One descendant provided a comparison sample, and specialists compared genetic markers to establish a familial link. The result of those combined efforts gave the tiny coffin a name. Edith Howard Cook, born November 29, 1873, and died October 13, 1876, a child just shy of 3 years old. Forensic analyses suggested chronic malnutrition, known in medical terms as marasmus, and dietary changes in the months leading to her death. Those findings were presented as analyses based on the remains and associated materials, not as conclusive narratives about circumstances or intent. Age estimates placed her between about 2 and 3.5 years old. Each statement in the chain, the name, the dates, the forensic impressions, came from records, lab work, and historical comparison. They were not speculative flourishes, but the outcomes of coordinated research. Identification was not the end of the story, but it changed the way people thought about the little coffin. The case moved from being an unsettling curiosity to becoming a small act of restoration. Garden of Innocents arranged a formal reburial. More than 100 people attended the ceremony. Volunteers, descendants, or distant relations who had been traced, city representatives, and neighbors who had watched the story unfold. A headstone now stands with her full name and dates. Technicians also produced a computer-assisted facial reconstruction based on the skull and age estimates, not as a definitive portrait, but as a way to translate a name into the human face it once was. That public ceremony matters because it was, at its core, about dignity. Few artifacts in a city more eloquently demand attention to collective memory than a grave displaced by progress. The reinterment did not erase the fact that a child had been forgotten under concrete for more than a century. But it did insist that a name, and a life, however brief, be acknowledged and marked. This kind of discovery is not unique to San Francisco. Around the world, urban growth and renovation sometimes dislodge inconvenient traces of the past. During a restoration in France, workers opening the cellar of an old mansion uncovered human remains, a discovery that prompted a police inquiry and further forensic work. Each case shares a similar pattern. Routine construction reveals a private history. Modern authorities and community groups must decide how to respond, and a broader conversation begins about how cities remember the dead. Those conversations are about more than curiosity. They raise questions about responsibility. When cemeteries are moved, who verifies that every grave was transferred? When records are incomplete or lost, how does a city account for lives that slip through bureaucratic cracks? And when modern homeowners learn that their property sits on top of a forgotten burial, what are their obligations, legal, moral, and financial, to rectify that buried past? There are no easy answers. Municipalities vary widely in how they handle historic reinterments. Funding avenues can be inconsistent, and families are sometimes impossible to trace. Nonprofits like Garden of Innocents provide one model. Community volunteers, forensic partnerships, and fundraising combine to restore names and provide ceremonial closure. Universities and labs bring the scientific tools that can convert a fragment of bone and a thread of documentation into an identity. But these processes require time, money, and a willingness on the part of local authorities and citizens to treat such discoveries as public responsibilities rather than merely homeowner problems. If the initial outrage around cases like this often centers on the shock of discovery, the more lasting moral demand is quieter. Commit to remembering. Cities are layered places. Streets, houses, and parks sit atop a palimpsest of human lives. Some of those layers were tended carefully, others were neglected or erased in the name of development. When the past resurfaces, we are forced to decide whether we will honor what is revealed. The small coffin beneath Erica's garage forced a city to reckon with that choice. It redirected attention from a generic fascination with a missing child narrative to the very real obligations of identification and care for someone who had been anonymous for generations. In the end, the child received a name, a marker, and a public reburial. Science and persistence restored a thread of history that might otherwise have remained severed. There is a lesson here beyond any single case. Looking for disappearances matters. Demanding answers matters. But it is equally important to examine what has been left underground. The neglected graves, the unrecorded histories, the lives that were not considered worth the bureaucratic burden of accurate record-keeping. Honoring those who were forgotten asks less of us in financial terms than in moral terms. Do we as communities and institutions accept responsibility for the layers of our cities and the people embedded in them? If this story resonated with you, please like and share it. And tell us in the comments whether your town has a similar hidden past. How should cities balance growth with stewardship of their buried history? The answers begin with attention, not only to what is missing, but to what remains.